The room lights dimmed on their own timer, leaving only the soft glow from the monitor beside my bed. I shifted slightly, feeling the stiffness in my back from the long day of tests. As the quiet settled in, a small wave of relief moved through me, just enough to make the thought of sleep feel welcome. Then the door eased open, and the night nurse slipped inside with a look that stopped my breath mid-exhale. She leaned close, her voice low and steady. "Don't sleep yet. Someone changed your dosage." The words were so direct, so bare, that for a second I wasn't sure I heard her right. My eyes flicked toward the hallway, and that's when I saw him, my son, standing just far enough from the door to look like he didn't belong there. He wasn't moving. He wasn't speaking. He was simply watching. I felt a cold pull in my chest, the kind that comes when the world tilts in a way you can't explain. The nurse didn't touch me or repeat herself. She just held my gaze, her expression sharp with something unspoken but unmistakably urgent. She wasn't guessing. She wasn't uncertain. She was warning me. When my son realized I was looking directly at him, he stepped back with a quick, stiff movement and disappeared around the corner. It wasn't smooth or casual. It was the kind of retreat you make when you're doing something you shouldn't be caught doing. I tried to swallow, but my throat felt dry. The nurse checked the IV line without explaining anything further. Her hands moved calmly, but her eyes kept flicking toward the hallway, as if she expected someone to return. I watched every small shift in her expression, trying to understand the weight behind her words. Nothing about her face suggested a mistake or routine check. Whatever had brought her into my room wasn't standard. I felt the mattress sink slightly as I adjusted my arm, trying to gather my thoughts. The air in the room felt heavier now, as though something had changed without making a sound. I thought about how long my son had been at the hospital that day. Too long, really. He had arrived early, hovered through the afternoon, and barely said a word during dinner. I had chalked it up to worry or stress, but standing in that hallway, staring at me like that was something else. The nurse finished resetting the monitor and straightened up slowly. She didn't lean in again or whisper anything further. She just gave one small nod, firm and deliberate, as if confirming she had done what she needed to do. Then she walked out of the room with measured steps, her posture tight, her attention fixed ahead. I stayed still, listening to the soft hum of the machines and the faint shuffle of feet outside the door. Sleep was nowhere near me now. Instead, there was a single, steady thought settling in my mind. Something dangerous was happening, and it wasn't coming from the hospital staff. It was already standing in the hallway. When my wife passed, the house didn't just get quiet. It changed shape. Rooms that once felt warm turned still, as if the air inside them had stopped moving. I tried keeping myself busy, but grief has a way of pulling you back into the chair you've been avoiding, settling on your shoulders no matter how you shift. The days blurred into each other, and I stopped noticing how often I let things slide. Mail unopened, appointments delayed, small tasks left for later, losing her softened parts of me that should have stayed firm. It was during that time my son began showing up more often. At first, I took it as kindness. He'd offer to drive me to appointments, pick up my prescriptions, sit in the kitchen while I made tea. He didn't speak much about my wife, but he seemed to fill the silence with a sort of practical concern. I was too empty to question it. When someone steps into a lonely house, you don't think about their reason. You just feel the space warm up again. Over time, though, I noticed little shifts in his tone. He spoke about my health as if he were reporting numbers, not talking to his father. He'd tap his foot when I moved slowly or sigh when I misplaced something. It wasn't cruel, but it wasn't patient either. There was a sharpness beneath his words, the kind that hides itself behind good intentions. I felt it, but I didn't push back. Grief makes you too tired to read between the lines. There were moments when small disagreements turned into something heavier. If I questioned a bill he reviewed, he'd brush it off with a quick explanation. If I said I didn't want to take a certain medication yet, he'd say the doctor insisted. I never heard the doctor say it myself, but I didn't challenge him. I let him stand between me and the parts of life I didn't want to manage anymore. I told myself it was temporary, that I just needed time. Looking back, there were red flags I treated like harmless shadows. A form moved from my desk without my knowledge. A prescription I didn't remember asking for. Bank papers he read through before I even touched them. He had a habit of taking things into his hands before I had the chance to think about them. At the time, it felt like help. Now, the memory stings in a different way. The nurse's whisper replayed in my mind, pulling those old moments out of the dark corners where I had tucked them away. Her warning didn't change the past, but it changed the weight of it. Suddenly, the times my son insisted on picking up my medication weren't gestures of support. They were steps in a pattern I had never noticed forming. The way he stood in the hallway earlier, half hidden, watching the door, gave those memories an edge I couldn't ignore. I sat in the hospital bed, the room cold and still, and let the pieces fall where they naturally belonged. None of them pointed to a simple misunderstanding. They pointed to a long stretch of time where I had been too trusting, too worn down, too willing to hand over control, without thinking about the cost. And now, with a single whisper, everything I once dismissed felt like something I should have seen coming. The next morning, my son arrived earlier than usual, carrying a paper cup sealed with a plastic lid. He set it on the tray beside my bed before I even had time to sit up fully. "You should take your medication now," he said, his voice clipped as if the timing were urgent. I glanced at the clock. It was almost an hour before the nurse normally brought anything. His insistence felt out of place, too sharp for a routine morning. I told him I wasn't ready yet, but he nudged the cup closer, tapping the lid with his finger. "The doctor said you need to stay ahead of the pain," he added. The wording didn't match anything my doctor had ever told me. It sounded rehearsed, like a line he had practiced on the way here. When I asked which doctor told him that, he hesitated just long enough to make the silence noticeable, then named someone I wasn't assigned to. The explanation slid out of him too fast, too smooth to feel honest. A nurse walked in moments later, checking the monitor and my vitals with her calm, precise movements. My son stepped aside but didn't leave the room. He watched her closely, arms crossed, his foot tapping against the floor. When she saw the cup he brought, she picked it up and examined the label. Her brow furrowed in a subtle, unmistakable frown. She didn't say anything, but her eyes shifted toward me with a brief question in them, one she couldn't voice with him standing there. After she left, I opened the lid of the cup and looked at the pill sitting inside. The color was off, slightly darker than the one I had taken at home before the hospital stay. I held it up toward the window to be sure. It wasn't the same. Something about that difference pressed a weight onto my chest, a quiet alarm that didn't need words. My son noticed the hesitation and slipped into a cheerful tone that didn't match his earlier urgency. "They probably changed the supplier," he said, smiling wide enough to show teeth. The smile looked borrowed, like he'd pulled it from someone else's face and didn't know how to wear it properly. He talked about the weather, about lunch, about anything except the medication. His words tumbled over each other, light and overly familiar, the way people talk when they're hiding a tremor under their voice. I placed the pill back in the cup without taking it. His smile tightened. For a moment, something flickered across his face, a flash of irritation he tried to swallow. It disappeared as quickly as it appeared, replaced by another too bright grin. He made a joke about hospital food, laughed at it himself, and straightened the blanket at the end of my bed, as if that small act could distract me from everything else. The nurse returned quietly, checking my chart again. She ran her finger along the dosage section, then glanced at the pill my son brought. Her eyes narrowed just enough for me to see she noticed the inconsistency. She didn't speak, not with him there, but I felt the tension in the room shift. Something wasn't right, and now someone besides me could sense it. My son clapped his hands together softly and said he'd step out for a minute. His voice was light, but his shoulders were stiff as he left the room. For the first time, I felt the crack in his mask widen. When the day shift nurse came in after breakfast, I waited until she finished checking the monitor before asking her to look at my chart. She pulled the tablet from her pocket and tapped through the screens with practiced ease. Her calm expression didn't change at first, but I watched the way her eyes moved. Slow, careful, tracking details she already knew by heart. When she reached the medication record, her lips pressed together in a thin line. She pointed at the most recent entry. "Your dosage was normal this morning," she said quietly. Nothing out of the ordinary. The certainty in her voice made the memory of the night nurse's warning echo louder in my mind. I asked her to scroll back to the previous change. She hesitated, just for a second, then opened the extended log. That's when the shift in her posture told me something wasn't right. The last modification wasn't made by her or by anyone from the night shift. The initials beside the update belonged to no one I recognized. She double-checked the staff list on the next screen. and the color drained slightly from her face. "This login doesn't match anyone assigned to your care," she said. Her tone stayed controlled, but there was a new heaviness behind each word. She checked the timestamp next, and that sealed the unease that had been building in my chest. The dosage change was marked just after visiting hours began, around the time my son had walked in yesterday, with a bag of fast food and a restless energy he couldn't hide. The nurse didn't say it directly, but the timing spoke for itself. She adjusted the chart back to the main screen and lowered her voice. "Family interference. It's not uncommon," she murmured, her eyes flicking toward the door as if she expected someone to be listening. "If you notice anything off, you let us know." Her warning wasn't dramatic, wasn't emotional, but it landed heavier than anything said outright. I nodded without speaking. There was no relief in hearing it confirmed, only a quiet understanding that the pieces were starting to connect in ways I wished they didn't. Later, when my son returned with his usual half-smile, I asked simple questions first. Nothing pointed, nothing direct. I asked where he had put my pill organizer at home. I asked who told him the dosage needed changing. I asked whether he'd talked to the doctor personally or just heard something secondhand. Each question was soft, almost casual. The effect wasn't. His answers came too quickly, too confident, like he'd prepared them before stepping into the room. He mentioned one doctor, then corrected himself, naming another. He said he didn't touch my pills, then claimed he reorganized them last week. He laughed at his own confusion, calling it stress, but his hands fidgeted with the edge of the blanket. He couldn't stay still. When I asked, lightly, what time he had arrived yesterday, he paused longer than the question required. That pause told me more than his answer. His eyes kept slipping to the chart on the wall, then back to me, then to the cup holding the morning pills the nurse had placed on the tray. The nerves he tried to hide were visible now, turning his smile into something strained. The chart hadn't shown everything, but it showed enough. I asked the nurse to help me get a copy of my full medication history from the hospital pharmacy. She didn't question the request. She simply nodded and wheeled me down the hallway in a slow, steady silence. The pharmacy window was tucked in a corner of the floor, away from the regular patient flow. When the pharmacist saw my chart in the nurse's hand, his polite smile tightened just slightly, as though he sensed there was more behind the request. He printed the record and studied it before handing it over. His eyes lingered on the most recent dosage change, and his brow creased. "This update is unusual for someone your age," he said, keeping his voice low. He didn't sound alarmed, but he didn't sound comfortable either. He tapped the screen behind the counter to double-check, his fingers moving with careful precision. When the same result appeared, the crease in his forehead deepened. He explained that this particular adjustment carried a higher risk for seniors, especially at night. The calm way he said it made the information colder, heavier. He traced the timeline with his finger and pointed to the flagged alert, a quiet warning built into the system. "This shouldn't have been changed without a review," he added. There was no drama in his voice, just fact. Firm, undeniable fact. I looked at the printed sheet in my hands. The numbers were small, simple, nothing dramatic on their own. But the alignment of timing, the inconsistency in the login, and now the risk associated with the dosage, it all sat together too neatly to ignore. The pharmacist shifted his weight slightly and added, almost reluctantly, "We've seen issues before when families handle prescriptions outside the hospital." He didn't say more. He didn't need to. A memory surfaced, my son insisting on picking up my prescriptions at home to make things easy. He had been doing it for months, always waving off my questions with a quick answer. At the time, it seemed helpful. Now it felt like the beginning of something I never recognized. I remembered the way he'd shuffle the bags, how he'd take the paperwork out before passing me the bottles, saying he'd keep the receipts in case we needed them later. I had let him. I had been tired. That tiredness felt like a mistake now. The pharmacist printed a second page, this one listing the medication type itself. He pointed to a line of text noting its use in several prior cases involving sedation risks in older patients. "Over-sedation is a concern," he said quietly, "especially at night." He didn't make it sound dramatic. He made it sound real. As we left the window, the nurse's hand tightened just slightly on the wheelchair handles. The hallway seemed longer than before, each step of the wheels echoing the new truth settling into my mind. Nighttime sedation, higher risk for seniors, a change made under someone else's login, an insistence from my son that I take the pill early, take it on time, take it without question. In the quiet of that hallway, the realization formed with sharp clarity. If I had taken the altered pill the night before, I might not have woken up as easily. I might not have woken at all. The thought didn't come with panic. It came with something colder, a steady awareness of just how vulnerable the night could have made me. And for the first time, the danger felt real enough to touch. The doctor called me into a small consultation room at the end of the hallway, the kind with hard chairs and a table too clean to feel welcoming. He closed the door quietly behind us, then sat across from me with my chart open in front of him. The air felt colder in there, as if the walls held onto the seriousness of every conversation that had taken place before ours. His eyes moved through the records slowly, and when he finally looked up, the expression he wore wasn't routine. He turned the chart so I could see the highlighted dosage change. "This adjustment," he said, tapping the line with one finger, "could cause respiratory distress in someone your age, especially during sleep." His tone wasn't dramatic, but it carried a weight that settled into my chest like a stone. There was no gentle phrasing, no softening of the truth. He wanted me to hear it clearly. He asked who usually brought my medications from home. It seemed like a simple question, but my throat tightened around the answer. The memory of my son in the hallway, the way he stepped back when he saw me looking, the cup he had pushed toward me, it all flickered through my mind. In a single, sharp moment, I didn't respond right away. The silence stretched just long enough for the doctor to recognize what it meant. He set the chart down and leaned slightly forward. "Someone wants you sedated," he said, his voice low and steady. He didn't blink when he said it. He didn't search for my reaction. He stated it like a fact that needed no dressing. The room felt smaller after that, the air heavier, as though the truth had pushed everything else aside. He began explaining patterns he had seen before, cases where a family member managed access to medication, where dosage changes were made quietly, where the victim didn't realize the danger until something serious happened. His words were clinical, but they cut through me with a sharp clarity. He described how sedatives can be manipulated, how nighttime doses make someone more vulnerable, how control over medicine often becomes control over everything else. I listened without interrupting, each detail aligning too neatly with what had been happening to me. He emphasized that the record showed an unauthorized login, a change entered at a time that didn't match staff activity. He didn't accuse anyone directly, but the implication was unmistakable. It pointed in one direction, one I had been trying not to name out loud. When he finished, he folded his hands and waited, giving me space to absorb what he already knew I understood. I felt a slow, steady shift inside me, a kind of clarity I hadn't allowed myself to acknowledge until now. The trust I'd placed in my son, the access I had handed over without question, the decisions I'd stepped back from because I was tired, all of it added up to a vulnerability I couldn't afford anymore. The doctor told me we would take protective steps within the hospital. He spoke calmly, outlining the measures without turning the conversation into a crisis. He didn't mention the police. He didn't push me for details. He just made sure I knew the danger was real. When he stood to leave, he paused with his hand on the door. "You're not alone in this," he said. But the truth hit harder than his reassurance. Family wasn't the safety I had believed it to be. Not anymore. I left that room knowing something had changed. And it wasn't the dosage. It was me. I waited until the hall was quiet before calling the nurse back into the room. She stepped inside with the same calm posture she always had, but I could see the alertness in her eyes. Without raising my voice, I told her I needed the altered pill saved, along with its label. She didn't ask why. She simply nodded once, slipped on gloves, and placed both items into a small evidence envelope she sealed with a firm press of her thumb. The gesture was small, but it felt like the first solid step I had taken on my own. Later that afternoon, the doctor returned with printed logs. He set them on the tray beside my bed, the pages neatly stapled, each timestamp highlighted in yellow. "This shows the unauthorized access," he said, keeping his tone even. No alarm, no dramatics, just proof, quiet, undeniable proof. I held the papers and scanned the lines myself. Seeing it in writing made the danger feel sharper, almost physical. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a glitch. Someone had gone into my records with intent. My son arrived soon after, carrying another cup with medication inside. His smile was thin, stretched tight across his face. "You need to stay on schedule," he said, setting the cup down like it was an instruction, not a suggestion. I waited a few, seconds before responding, letting the silence settle between us. Then I told him I'd take it later. His jaw tightened. The cheerfulness he put on never reached his eyes. The more I delayed, the more strained his voice became. The tension wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It sat there, thick and unmistakable. When he stepped out for a phone call, I picked up my belongings one by one and moved them to the far side of the room, away from where he usually stood. My wallet, my keys, the notebook I kept in my drawer, they all went into the bedside cabinet that locked with a simple turn. I didn't make a sound while doing it. I didn't need anyone to see. These were just the steps of a man finally protecting what should have been protected long ago. Later that evening, when the halls had thinned out and the lights dimmed, I used the hospital phone to call an old friend from my military days. His voice carried that steady calm I remembered. No questions asked, just readiness. I told him I needed advice, not details, not a full story, just guidance on how to handle something that didn't feel safe anymore. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said he would come by in the morning. That was all. No panic, no judgment, just support I could trust. My son returned again right before visiting hours ended. He hovered near the doorway, watching me in a way that felt different from concern. He asked whether I had taken the pill yet. I told him no. His fingers tapped against the doorframe, a fast, restless pattern. He didn't raise his voice, didn't argue, but the unease beneath his words had lost its disguise. The mask he'd worn for weeks was beginning to slip. As he turned to leave, I felt a calm settle in me. Not relief, but resolve. I had the pill, the label, the logs, and someone coming who truly stood on my side. The silence wasn't weakness anymore. It was preparation. The door swung open harder than it needed to, hitting the wall with a dull thud. My son stepped inside with a force that didn't match the quiet of the hospital floor. He held a small paper cup in one hand, gripping it so tightly the rim bent. "It's time for your night dose," he said, closing the door behind him with his foot. His tone wasn't pretending anymore. Whatever mask he'd worn earlier was gone. I sat upright and kept my voice steady. "I'm not taking anything right now." I didn't raise the volume, didn't add emotion. The words came out calm enough to make his expression tighten. He walked closer, thrusting the cup toward me as if proximity itself would convince me. "You can't skip this," he snapped. "You don't understand how important this is." The urgency in his voice wasn't concern. It was pressure. He planted the cup on the tray beside me, breathing through clenched teeth. "Things need to be finalized," he muttered, almost under his breath. "We're running out of time." He didn't seem to realize. He'd said it aloud. When I didn't respond, he froze, as if replaying the words in his head. His eyes flickered with the realization that he'd slipped. I looked at him without speaking. My silence seemed to push him further off balance. He stepped back, then forward again, pacing in a small, agitated arc. "Why are you making this so difficult?" he said, voice cracking in a way he tried immediately to cover. "I'm doing everything for you, for us." The words felt rehearsed, but the tone betrayed something harder. Fear, impatience, desperation. Outside the room, footsteps moved quickly down the hall. A raised voice, his, must have carried beyond the closed door. A moment later, the handle turned, and the nurse walked in with the doctor right behind her. They paused when they saw his stance, the cup, the tension in the room. The nurse's eyes went straight to the tray, where the pills sat untouched. My son's face changed the instant they entered. This isn't what it looks like," he said, stumbling over the words. "Your staff messed up his chart. I'm just trying to keep him on schedule." His voice shook with a thin thread of panic he couldn't hide. He reached toward the cup, as if moving it would erase everything. The doctor stepped forward and placed a folder on the end of my bed. He opened it without looking away from my son. Inside were the login logs, the flagged dosage change, the pharmacy's printed warning, and the sealed envelope holding the altered pill and label. He didn't need to say a word. The evidence spoke for him. My son's face drained of color. He pointed at the documents, then at the nurse, then at me. "You're all twisting this," he said, voice rising despite himself. "You think I'd ever do something to hurt him? You're setting me up." The more he spoke, the more tangled his explanations became. Contradictions spilling out faster than he could catch them. The doctor remained still, letting him talk. The nurse didn't move either. Their silence made his unraveling louder. He tried blaming a pharmacy error, then claimed he'd been asked to help, then insisted the doctor approved everything. Each excuse broke under the weight of the paperwork in front of us. He backed toward the door, breath unsteady, eyes wide. "This is all wrong," he said, but the certainty had drained from his voice. He wasn't defending himself anymore. He was exposed. The room felt tight, the air pressed in by the truth finally breaking through. Hospital security arrived within minutes, walking in with the steady, deliberate pace of people trained to act without hesitation. They didn't raise their voices or ask him to explain. One officer simply stepped beside my son and said, "Sir, we need you to come with us." The firmness in his tone left no room for argument. My son looked between the officers, the doctor and me, searching for an opening that wasn't there. When none appeared, his shoulders sagged, and he let them escort him out of the room. The hallway grew quiet again after the doors closed. The nurse exhaled softly, then began documenting the incident with quick, practiced motions. The doctor placed the evidence folder in his bag and told me an investigator from the hospital's compliance team would come by shortly. His voice remained steady, never drifting into sympathy or judgment. The moment wasn't about emotion, it was about process. The investigator arrived within the hour. She introduced herself calmly, carrying a tablet and a small recording device. She interviewed the doctor first, then the nurse, then reviewed the sealed envelope containing the altered pill and label. She checked the chart logs, scrolling through the timestamps with her brow furrowing more deeply each time she compared them to the staff schedule. When she reached the line showing the unauthorized login, she tapped it twice, marking it for her report. She asked the nurse a few clarifying questions. Who had access to the medication room? Who had been on shift? Whether any staff had handled my dosage overnight? Each answer drew the same conclusion. No one on duty had made the change. When she finished, she turned to the pharmacy logs. The records matched exactly what the doctor had shown me earlier. An unsanctioned update, flagged due to risk, entered at a time that aligned with my son's visit. There was no guessing left. The pieces fit cleanly, coldly, into place. She told me they would file formal documentation and forward it to the appropriate authorities. The procedure wasn't loud or dramatic. It moved step by step, guided by policy, grounded in evidence. She reassured me that my account, prescriptions, and medical records would be locked under heightened security until everything was resolved. The hospital had systems for situations like this, situations I never imagined applying to my own family. Later, hospital administration met with me briefly to discuss safeguarding measures. Access to my patient file was restricted to a small list of staff. Medication could only be dispensed directly by designated nurses. My insurance account was temporarily frozen for verification. It felt strange hearing these protections laid out like a checklist, as if they were meant for someone else. But the truth stood right in front of me. They were needed, for me. In the quiet moments after everyone left, I sat back against the raised bed, letting the weight of everything settle. There was no anger boiling in my chest, no outburst waiting to break free. What I felt instead was a steady heaviness, an ache in a place deeper than fear. Losing trust in a son isn't like losing an object or a moment. It's losing the belief that blood guarantees anything. I stared at the empty chair where he had sat the day before, talking to me like a man doing me a favor. Now the silence around it felt different. It wasn't peaceful. It wasn't comforting. It was final. Families aren't supposed to be threats, but sometimes they are. And now the system was protecting me from the person who should have protected me first. The sky outside my window was still dim when the nurse brought in the morning medications, placing them on the tray with a deliberate clarity I hadn't paid attention to before all this. She explained the new protocol, strict controls, locked storage, double verification, and I signed the paperwork confirming that no one, not even family, could access my medication without written authorization. I initialed every line slowly, aware of the weight behind each stroke of the pen. These weren't just forms. They were boundaries I should have drawn a long time ago. When the administrative officer arrived later that morning, she reviewed the legal adjustments with me one by one. My records now required two-factor verification. My insurance account had a new passcode known only to me. My prescriptions could no longer be picked up by anyone else, no matter the circumstance. I listened carefully, absorbing each measure like a man relearning how to stand on solid ground. She asked if I wanted to designate a medical proxy. I told her no, not yet, not after what happened. She didn't press. After she left, I sat still for a long moment, letting the quiet settle. It wasn't the kind of silence that comes from loss, though I felt that too. It was a clearer silence, one that allowed me to look honestly at the months leading up to this. My trust had been soft. My silence had been easier than asking questions. Grief had made me lean on the closest person without thinking about the weight I was placing in their hands. That choice gave someone room to build a plan behind my back, brick by brick, while I kept telling myself it was help. I understood now how quickly vulnerability can turn into opportunity for the wrong person. It doesn't happen all at once. It happens in small moments. Letting someone pick up a prescription, letting them read your mail, letting them explain things you should verify yourself. Each moment feels harmless on its own. Together, they create the opening someone needs to take more than they should ever have held. I thought about the advice I wished someone had given me earlier. Check every change, no matter how minor. Ask who entered your records and why. Confirm instructions directly with the doctor. Never assume a login belongs to who it claims to. Don't let convenience become a blindfold. These aren't signs of distrust. They're signs of protecting yourself in a world where not everyone cares for the elderly the way they claim to. When I was discharged, I took my time gathering my things. I moved slowly, not because of weakness, but because each action felt intentional. At home, I put my documents in order. I organized my medications, labeled every bottle, and stored them in a locked cabinet. I set reminders on my phone instead of relying on someone else to manage my schedule. These routines weren't burdensome. They were mine. And for the first time in a long while, that felt like strength. I walked through the quiet house with steady steps, aware of every corner, every chair, every framed photo. The shadows didn't feel threatening. They just felt honest. I wasn't looking for reconciliation or answers. I wasn't trying to fill the empty spaces. I was simply accepting what was true. Age didn't put me in danger. My trust did. Growing old isn't the danger. Trusting the wrong person is.